granniopteryx, granniopteryx. She knows the truth, she's linking every link.
Hello, I'm going to be talking about socialism, and I'm going to be begging any American who sees this video not to allow your government to make the same mistakes that my government made starting years ago. And it's all to do with socialism. I've often remarked that socialists think in a very old-fashioned way. If you've been watching my videos for any length of time, I will have mentioned this once or twice during the course of my canon. It's sort of ironic, actually, that socialists are so old-fashioned, because you wouldn't find a single socialist who wouldn't say that he or she or Jim or je or they or them, they reckon they're the most progressive thinkers in society, don't they? And they are not. They're stuck in a world that no longer exists. For a start, socialism requires high and constant taxes and the imposition of crippling financial extortion was possible right up until fairly recently, but it isn't anymore. Socialist governments, with their ideas of redistribution, could retain power in the last century, but that was when people were still stuck to the countries and the states where they grew up. So governments could tax people, knowing that they couldn't escape. But with increasingly easy population mobility, that's no longer a given. It started very slowly in the West in the 20th century with a small movement of population among a very narrow band of high earners. For instance, performers. Groups like the Rolling Stones, David Bowie, Rod Stewart, they moved to France, they moved to Switzerland, moved to the U.S.A. to avoid British super taxes, which were astonishing at that time. There's something like 98%. You wouldn't believe it. But at the time, it wasn't considered all that serious that these small groups were going, because everyone else was stuck here. After all, during the early and mid-20th century, there was still a lot of people tied to the land in some way or another. Much of the British economy still had to do with land ownership in various ways. There were farmers, of course, and producers. There were also heavy industries, mining and the like, and so they were all fairly easily got at. And then there was inheritance tax at the end of it. So a whole series of governments clung on to the idea that you can tax people, and even though they might complain, well, where would they go? Steel, for instance, that's a very good example. It had to be produced and it had to be worked here, because transporting iron and finished metal products from other countries, well, that was going to be hideously expensive, slow and restricted. And so it was right up until the invention of the container ship. Now it's cheaper to haul the stuff from India than to dig it out of the ground right here beneath our feet. Even before the container ships, the warnings of changes to come were there. Even earlier than the Rolling Stones, for instance, at the beginning of the National Health Service, there was an exodus of doctors, mostly to the United States, because some doctors didn't think much of the deal the NHS was offering. You see, doctors had movable qualifications, so they moved. There was a lot of criticism levelled at them in the British press at the time, and most Brits considered them deserters, but they went anyway. And any government thinking ahead might have noticed that people with movable assets might actually move. And you'd think they could have taken that as a warning. And this is a warning I'm giving you people in America. I don't know whether it's too late for us here, but we're certainly in a pickle because of that attitude. And the governments here didn't take that as a warning. They relied on the historical habits of the British patriot, and for a while their trust wasn't misplaced, even with the overtaxation that started in the 1960s. Most British people and most British industries stayed. But now things are different. More and more of our industries are conducted elsewhere in the world. And so fewer and fewer people are stuck to the land. There's less land ownership and there's less industry and no mining. And entrepreneurs find it just as easy to re-site their industrial production to other countries. Countries that have a cheaper workforce, less insurance, and fewer health and safety and DEI requirements, as well as personal tax of the people who are running the business. James Dyson, for instance, the man who invented an innovative vacuum cleaner, moved his entire production to Malaysia, explaining that this move meant his company had 30% lower production costs. 30% is quite a chunk. The irony is he was a major contributor to the Labour Party, the very party which makes much of its support for workers' rights. But when it came to that 30%, suddenly all his principles went to Malaysia. And in Malaysia, he could get much cheaper workers with fewer rights and less inclination to strike. The result for Britain was a much reduced tax income from Mr. Dyson's company, and of course, he isn't the only one. So, the present government has been reduced to scraping pennies off pensioners and off what's left of our struggling farmers, those being the only ones they know are stuck here. As I said, there's something remarkably old-fashioned about socialism, and the reason I'm bringing this up is the news I'm getting from the U.S.A. For instance, the governor of Washington state signed a millionaire tax into law in March 2026, and this follows a set of similar taxes in California, in New York, in Massachusetts, and in New Jersey. I just thought you Yanks should pay attention to what happened in the UK following that path. Actually, the situation might be even worse in the USA because people and businesses are far more mobile in the States. It's much easier to move from one state to the other. Here, you'd have to move, for instance, it used to be that you'd have to move, for instance, from Britain to Germany, a language problem, all that sort of thing. In America, none of that exists. I've been reading about several multi-million-dollar concerns moving from New York and Washington to Florida and Texas. And so Florida and Texas will be getting the taxes from now on, while Washington and New York will find it more and more difficult to balance the books. It's not land ownership anymore, it's not even haulage, it's high tech, it's financial management, it's franchises, and their headquarters could be anywhere, and their bosses could be living anywhere, and all they have to do is sell their penthouse flat in one place and find another penthouse flat somewhere else. And this is what I mean about socialism being an old-fashioned idea. Now, Soviet Russia dealt with the possibility of population drain because they made life so awful for people. They held on to their population artificially by just stopping people from leaving. That's one way of dealing with that, but at least for now, that's not what a Western democracy can do. The thing is that a lot of modern socialists seem to have the idea that this is exactly what they can do. Then they get surprised when it doesn't work. And they're surprised because they have an old-fashioned way of thinking. Yeah, there's the Soviet Russian model of taxing people or forcing them in compelled work, which is, in a way, a form of tax, and then stopping them from leaving when they don't like it. But the world isn't the same as it was. And it looks like very few governments, and here I'm not just talking about the socialist ones, very few governments have the ability or the imagination to keep up with this unprecedented social change. Milei, the president of Argentina, he seems to get it. But all governments are going to be affected, but the socialist governments will be the worst affected because, going on form, I've noticed that the sort of person who believes that socialism is the answer tends also to be the sort of person who believes that sex can be changed to order. In other words, there's this mindset more inclined to consider a pious fantasy as more real than reality itself. So despite the obvious, constant and unignorable examples of socialist failure in the 20th century, and despite the obvious, constant and unignorable examples of high taxes causing lost taxpayers and therefore lost tax, they still plug on, repeating the same debunked ideas and ignoring the evidence. As Chico Marx said presciently, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? Till next time. You can help my channel by subscribing and clicking the notification bell. That's quite important. And by sharing if you're so inclined. Links to my other channels and to donation methods are in the description. But the best way you can help is simply by clicking like and notify. Thank you.